I have no way of verifying this story anymore, as it has just been passed down for generations in my family. My great-great-grandparents lived in rural Nebraska since they immigrated from Germany in the late 1800s. Near the turn of the century, disease was pretty rampant in the homesteading area, and it killed off members of almost every family. When someone died from illness, time was of the essence in burying them so as not to let the virus spread from the deceased to the living. This meant no wake periods. So a distant great-aunt of mine dies of some disease, and she gets buried in the family cemetery on the homestead. The dogs were very fond of her, so it wasn't too surprising that after the funeral, the 2 dogs stuck near the grave. The rest of the family began to think something of it when, a few days later, the dogs were still visiting her grave almost constantly. But they weren't just at the grave. They were visibly distressed, frantic, and often barking while there. This goes on for maybe a week when the family decides to check it out. They dig the casket up and open it. The deceased's hair has all been pulled out. Her fingers are raw and bloody and mangled from where, on the inside of the casket door, they can see deep scratches in the wood. She was comatose when they buried her, and she came to while underground, spending probably her last moments alive in a buried casket. When I was little, my parents would let me stay up late on weekends and watch TV until I fell asleep. I really loved these times, and I would stay up later than anybody else just because I could. Well, one night, I was almost asleep on the couch when I heard a noise on our front porch. It was the sound of our old-fashioned porch swing moving back and forth. I was a little scared, so I crept toward the bay windows of our living room and peeked out towards the porch. Sitting on the front porch swing was an older woman, probably in her 60s, wearing nothing but a nightgown, covered in blood and holding a huge kitchen knife. I flipped out immediately and ran screaming into my parents' room, but was too terrified to form words. My parents saw that I was upset, but when I finally was able to tell them what I saw, my dad got really angry and told me that it was just a dream and to go back to bed. I refused and kept crying and screaming until he had had enough and snatched my arm and dragged me towards the front door to prove that nothing was there. I kicked and screamed all the way trying to make him stop, but he kept pulling me. Finally, we got to the door. He unlocked it, swung it open, and said, "See, there's nothing He froze mid-sentence. To this day, I have never seen the look of fear and shock that was on his face when that woman turned and stared at both of us and slowly stood up with the knife. My dad slammed the door shut and got my mom to call the police while he went and got his gun. He went back to the door with a 12 gauge and cracked the door enough to stick the barrel out. He asked her what she was doing and she said, "Somebody killed my husband, but it wasn't me." My dad told her that the police were coming and she freaked out, grabbed the knife and walked away. The police found her 15 minutes later trying to break into one of our neighbors' houses. I never slept in the living room again. Recently, I talked to my mum and she said that they never really found out the whole story, but apparently that old woman was crazy and off her medication. She and her husband got into a fight and she tried to attack him with the knife, but didn't seriously hurt him. When he got her out of the house, she cut herself with the knife, either trying to commit suicide or make it look like her husband did it. The police never talked to us about it, so that's just what they heard from the neighbors. I had a blind dog named Oreo. When I was little, she barked at things that were there and things that weren't. One night, around midnight, she woke up my mom and I by barking at the wall next to the back door. My dad was a heavy sleeper. I woke up, but I was maybe 9 years old, so I went right back to sleep. My mom got up and ushered Oreo back to bed. That same night, an arsonist hit my neighborhood. They set fire to a luckily vacant house for sale, and it burned to the ground. Following his footsteps in the snow, he then passed between my bedroom and our garage and nearly lit our house. Then our dog and my mom woke up, and we think that scared him away, and he went across the street and burned the neighbor's garage instead. Then he stood in their front yard and watched it burn. He walked out onto the street, and they lost his footsteps. They never caught him. Rest well, Oreo, I miss you. You were a very good pup. When my friends and I initially entered college, we used to hang out a lot at my friend's dad's house, who lived out in the country. Late at night, when scanning the horizon, you could see all the stars. It wasn't like the city. You could also see a radio tower with faint red and white lights, perhaps a few miles away. One late night in October, maybe 1 or 2 in the morning, we decided to drive out to this radio tower just out of curiosity. It was in the middle of a large field with one entrance which happened to be open. We entered from there and drove about a 1/4 mile in towards the radio tower. When we got there, we noticed a rusty, beat-up car underneath the tower. The thing looked like it hadn't been driven in years. We pulled to the other side of the tower and just chilled for a little bit, talking about whatever and listening to music. Then one of my friends pointed towards the beat-up car. "Does it look like there's a light in there?" he said. We all stared at the car, and sure enough, emanating behind the dust-covered windows of the car was a dim light. We pretty quickly put our car in drive and started moving out of there. It was a field, though, so of course we moved relatively slow. The same friend who pointed out the light noticed that the car started moving along with us, following slowly. It didn't put on its headlights, but the light inside the car seemed to glow brighter. That was the moment that my friend driving screamed and hightailed it faster than I'd ever seen. We literally left the junk car in the dust, and from that day, we had always referred to this story as the ghost car story. Did we really believe in ghosts? Probably not, but paranormal is better than whatever else it could have been. Come to find out, a few years later, that field was regularly being monitored by the local sheriff's office for big drug deals that apparently went down there. Had we stuck around any longer that night than we did, we could have legitimately been killed. This was also in the era that we watched a lot of Breaking Bad, so in retrospect, it seemed to us like that could have very much been a likely outcome from that night. Luckily, we're all good and nothing bad ever came of it for any of us. When I was a teen, I was home alone singing. We lived on the edge of the woods and our closest neighbors were a 1/4 of a mile away. So there I am singing my heart out in the living room around 10 p.m. when the phone rings. I pick it up and all I hear is clapping. I bolted up and ran in the dark to my neighbors because I was so freaked out. Thankfully, they were good family friends and they let me stay until morning. I always assumed it was a ghost or something paranormal, but when I was telling my girlfriend about it, she asked if it had been a landline. She then tells me how you can press a number combo and make your own landline ring. Someone was in the house with me when it should have just been me. My family has a farm which is pretty isolated. There are other houses nearby, but are mostly abandoned. I spent a winter break there alone when I was 17, and I would be alone Monday to Friday, and my dad and brother would come on the weekends as it was a Christmas school break. I had some meat in a smoker next to my house. It's like a separate shed with a pizza oven where we smoke dry the meat and keep the logs and wood for our house's fireplace. So, anyway, it's around 3 a.m. winter, and it's been snowing for a few days. The first layer of snow froze and the wind is blowing new snow on top of it. As I'm walking from the house to the smoker, I stop for a bit to admire the sound it makes. It sounds like pouring sugar in a bowl. I then check up on the fire in the smoker, make sure it's out, get some more firewood for the house, and go to bed. I lock the door and go to the house. Still, I hear the faint noise the snow makes when it hits the surface. I go into the house, drop the firewood next to the furnace, and go out on the porch to put the ashes from the fire into the bin. And then there's silence. Complete and utter silence. At first, I think that it stopped snowing, but the snow is still falling the same way it was a minute ago. Immediately, I feel something is up. So as I'm turning my head scared, I'm expecting something to happen, and the hairs on my neck and arms have already stood up. Then I hear like a faint song, like a lullaby of a woman singing a baby to sleep. Nothing other than this song can be heard, even though it is fairly quiet and in a distance. I stand there and I'm frozen, and the song is echoing from the woods, but also kinda around the house. I'm not expecting anyone to jump out, but I didn't know where the noise is coming from. I run to the house and lock myself in the bedroom. The house is near the woods. It's been snowing and it's 3 a.m. Nobody would and should ever come close to the house at that hour. So I'm creeped out and can't go to sleep. I locked myself in the bedroom and stayed there until morning. Nothing happened, and I didn't hear the sound again. When my dad came a few days later, he just shrugged it off and said it may be time to go back home. I went home with him that Monday and never spent a day on my own in that house since. It was a few months later that I found out what really happened. The farm is in a small village populated by mostly old people, and some of them have no family and live alone. One old lady went missing that winter, but nobody reported it as she had no family or friends who would notice it. She lived in a small house on the far side of the forest with no electricity. She most likely had a stroke at some point or needed some other sort of help as she went through the woods towards our house. The lights in our house were on so it's visible at night, so that may be why she came to it. Also, my great-grandmother was like a village doctor, so she may have remembered her and wanted help. So the old woman tried to walk through these woods and couldn't speak, and she fell into a hole. It was a dried-up river basin, and she got stuck there and died. She was found a few months later in the woods, which is about 2 miles from our house. I'll never forget the sound she made and how it sounded exactly like an old lullaby. I'm not sure if it was because of the stroke or if I just imagined it. I was not okay for some time.